I would like to invite the two first speakers who will talk about their experience. First one is James Nadeau, and he is the director of the academic urology unit at the University of Applied Health Sciences of the University of Aberdeen. His research activity spans across evidence synthesis, trials, guidelines development, implementation science, big data, and he is leader coordinator of two large projects. One is the prostate and the other is the flagship. What we are here about is the PIONEER project, which is great. And the second speaker is Asha Golazar. She is a vice president, the global head of the data science at OHDSI's data services, which she leads a team of data scientists, epidemiologists and bioinformaticians focusing on epidemiological research and development and application of advanced and innovative analytics. And she is talking about also the OHDSI. So I don't know who is starting.
I'm starting.
Very good.
Assuming... good. It's amazing when technology works. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. We can certainly talk about how not to do it. That could be the whole talk, actually. But I think that let us start by me putting my cards on the table. Here you have two people that have grown up in Cochrane. And in Cochrane, at least for me as coordinating editor within Cochrane for a number of years, anything but an RCT was almost like the Antichrist. Almost. So to have people like us coming here talking about real-world data, you know there is a problem. And so we'll be delighted to share some experiences with you. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Golazar here with us. She's an amazing, talented, not only physician, but also very experienced in this real-world data space. The European Association of Urology is a professional medical society with about 19,000 surgeon members across Europe. And our purpose as a society 50 years ago was the improvement of patient care at the forefront of everything the association does. 50 years on, that purpose remains the same. Why? Because it represents our core values as physicians, as doctors. Yes, we are surgeons, but first and foremost, we are doctors. And so there's a more granular meaning of this, which means it must be evidence-based, patient-centric, cost-effective, and critically, data-driven towards value-based healthcare provision. Really, whatever we're doing in this space, for me, look at me, I'm 56, my time is over, my time is almost done. I may not see the end game, I may not see the benefits of all of what we're doing now, but we have a responsibility to decide what the future generation should be. And as surgeons, this work we're doing is only important, first and foremost, because we must redefine what the urologists of the future should be. Great surgeons, yes, but they must be able to lead with love and compassion. They must act with integrity. And I'll tell you about integrity in a second. We must understand and respect what patient engagement brings to the table. We must also be inclusive and diverse, of course, and we must understand that our purpose as doctors, forget we're surgeons, as I say, is a life of service to others, but our choices and our decisions must be anchored in data. Unfortunately, we have seen, some of us that have cared to look closely enough, there is a huge scandal in medical research of poor medical research. And some of you may know, God rest his soul, Professor Doug Altman, who said we need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. Abandoning using numbers of publications as a measure of ability would be a start. And Richard Smith, 20 years later, said unfortunately he feared things were only worse. We were commissioned by the UK government to look at evidence around treatment of benign prostate diseases, and what we found was equally terrible. Small RCTs, less than 100 patients in most of them, frankly terrible. You couldn't put your mortgage on them. Colleagues recently, one of them from Aberdeen, looked at, 49 Cochrane reviews and looked at all of the trials that were in them across the specialties. And they found about 1,659 trials from 84 countries, and unfortunately, close to 250,000 of participants in those trials were recruited in poor trials. Right? Yellow is really risk of bias where you could not put your mortgage in it. Urology is halfway up, and I see MS is right next to us. So we're not the worst, but we're not as good as the anesthetists, for example. At a huge cost. If these are such poor trials, why did they have ethical approval in the first place? These are things that we as a specialty in healthcare need to be careful about. If you look at meta-analysis from Cochrane, where we grew up, they were established for good. But now, if you look at meta-analysis and systematic reviews, they're almost hijacked for the benefit of industry. We should be able to work with industry for the benefit of patients and the greater good, but we should also make sure that it is not driven by vested interests or finance-based medicine. I strongly believe that to this day, evidence-based medicine is a worthy purpose to achieve. So why are we talking about real-world data? I grew up in trials because the evidence gaps are not being filled fast enough with RCTs, especially for surgical craft specialties like ours. Clinical trial populations are not generalizable. You don't often see long-term adverse effects or safety data in RCTs. Key subgroups, the elderly, comorbidities, polypharmacy, obesity. Well, there'll be nobody left in Scotland to recruit. Low-income countries, ethnic minorities. You don't see them in trials, but we take the results of the trials and we apply it to everyone else. What sense does that make? We should also not just think just because we come from so-called centers of excellence that our results are generalizable to somebody sitting in some small corner of Albania or Bulgaria or Hungary or even Africa or Latin America. We should understand that we should know what's happening in the real world, and we should collect data of every patient in our specialty that has an interaction with us, especially PREMS, quality of life, and ECOG status. And at this point, I'll invite Dr. Golozar.
Thank you so much, James. Thanks, everyone, for having me here. It's a true pleasure to be here. So I want to take you back to early 2000, just tell you a story of where all this is coming from, and then hopefully we jump into what you see on the slide, the Odyssey community. Up around early 2000, where FDA was increasing the number of withdrawals of the drug from the market. You all probably have heard about the Vioxx scandal. It became a big thing when in 2004, Merck had to withdraw Vioxx from the market. There were several congressional hearings around the same time, and FDA was being asked why this hasn't been investigated or assessed before. There's one very simple answer. Clinical trials are short in terms of duration, and also the number of patients that are involved in or recruited in the clinical trials are not enough to be able to assess and pick up all the safety signals that are important to patients. It was around that time that the Congress mandated the FDA Amendment Act, which mandated FDA to come up with a safety surveillance system by 2012. Where there should be a process for assessment and identification of safety signals using observational data. A lot happened after that, right? So the manufacturers and the data manufacturers comes and they say that, oh, we know the data, this is what we've been doing, we want to have a say in it. We know better which data to use, what methodology, and what to answer. There were scientists, people from the FDA and the other side, which also had the same interest. So a private-public partnership was founded at that time called OMAP, or Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, which focused on answering the same question: which database, which method to address what questions. And the idea was that so we can come up with a system of recommendation of how to use real-world data. Here we're talking about secondary data that's been collected for non-research purposes, very specifically claims data, EHR registry, and so on and so forth. Several experiences happened at the same time when they started with a series of questions, 10 pairs of outcomes and exposures with drugs and disease pairs, using 7 different methodology and looking across 10 different databases. So if you think about like doing each of these studies, 1 disease outcome pairs, 1 database, 7 methodology, just doing a simple math, you go into like thousands and thousands of simple little epidemiology or pharmacoepidemiology studies. It's not feasible, it's not scalable. Also, writing SAS scripts, commonly used for answering these questions, for each of them, it takes time, and then it's very, very likely that you actually make mistakes when you're trying to put one to the other. Around the same time, the idea of harmonization of the data came to existence. If we can actually harmonize data and harmonize methodology, we make this process highly efficient, reliable, and reproducible. That was the birth of OMAP Common Data Model, what we commonly use right now and what I'm going to talk about in a bit. So in 2012, the experiment ended, 2012-2013, with a series of results. Very, to just put it in summary, the choice, like based on the different database that you use, you would have like different type of performance. There is not one necessarily unique database to recommend, and also not one necessarily approach. It's a combination, and it also depends on what you're trying to answer. The OMAP mandate was ended, but that effort ended up with a collection of individuals who were highly enthusiastic to answer one question: how can we improve patient lives using better approach and better methodology? How can we ensure that we're using standardized methods to use secondary databases to address important health condition? That was the birth of OHDSI, or Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics Community. OHDSI is a community, is an open source community of researchers, physicians, epidemiologists, informaticians, and people who are genuinely enthusiastic to answer one question: improving health, human lives. So far, these numbers keeps updating by the day, but I can say we have over 3,000 collaborators around the world, coming from 74 different countries, 21 time zones, and 6 continents. We have data within the OHDSI network from 331 databases, EHR, administrative claims. We also have registry data coming from 34 continents and over 800 million patient records. What we do in the community is to come up with open source standards for representing data. That's what we call OMAP CDM. Come up with standardized methodological approach that can answer different use cases, and develop tools that can facilitate that open source development. And we're all doing that because we're all here to do clinical research, to come up with clinical evidence that is reliable and reproducible and can be used for decision making, either at the time for guidelines, for regulatory purposes, at the bedside, and so on. So, what's happening and what are we talking about? Generally, when I'm successful, when we do studies in a typical pharmacoepidemiology or an observational research, we come up with a question, or a researcher or a group of researchers come up with a question, as, for example, something like this: what is the adherence to my drug in the data set that I own? So we're thinking about like a analytic method. We want to look into drug adherence. We want to use it if the question is in my data. So application to the data is the plug. And my data can be any of these. My data can come from North America, Southeast Asia, and like different parts of the world, thinking about the different plugs that you have to use. How do we do it these days? So for each of them, we have to write a SAS scripts or an R package to be able to plug it to the database, because I have to know the database, the nuances of the database, how things are being coded. And that creates a mess like this. It's not scalable. We know it's not efficient. It's usually not transparent. And a lot of times there are a lot of, it's very prone to mistakes. But imagine a world that I have several tools, like it can be adherence, and everything can look the same. My data can talk the same language. Pain is pain. It doesn't matter where the data is coming from. Colorectal cancer is the same in the US, in the data from the US, from UK, or from China. And then I have the set of the tools, right? Like I can look into mortality, adherence, safety, prediction, so on. At that point, I have to go back. I don't need to write or have like multiple scripts. It's one package that can be applied and can be applied to all databases and can actually produce the kind of results that means the same and is highly reproducible. This approach allows us to do remote analytics. We don't need to have access to the data, right? We can send analytics to the data because data speaks the same language across the board. Data can be behind the firewall. We don't need to see the data. We know how it looks like. And very importantly, when we have that, we can think about a network of collaborators, a network of different data owners around the world, having data standardized and having this capability of taking advantage of this data to do federated learning and federated approach to answer several questions. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about opportunities for standardization. It's from the data, as I mentioned, the data model, the content of the data, the semantic, the analytic pieces, how we define the phenotypes, or what we call cohort definition in Odyssey, the analytics piece, and even the reporting. At each of these pieces, if we have standardized approach that are highly reproducible, we have increased the efficiency and improved the way that we're answering the questions. So I'll show you some of the models that we're using. So OMAP, this is an example, a picture of the OMAP Common Data Model. It's a patient-centric data. These are relational databases. They're expandable, and they're pretty much made for analytic purposes for research. In terms of the contents of the data, within OMAP or Odyssey, we're using standardized vocabulary. Conditions are all represented using the same code. For example, SNOMED, drugs are XNORM. For procedures, they're standard. So every different instances that we see in a patient record are being standardized to specific vocabulary and represented in a standardized fashion. And then when it comes to analytics, there are sets of a library of analytic packages that helps address several questions. This is just a snapshot of what's currently available at Hades, or what was used to call the methods library, which we have several packages that can run patient prediction models, different machine learning approaches, doing population level estimation or causal inference, simple characterizations, and doing evidence synthesis, evaluation of the methods, or empirical calibration. But what we all do that is to be able to make sense of it. So this is just like a picture of a patient journey. Just thinking about like each of those instances that you see is like one event that happens, and what we see in a patient records are literally just snapshots of something happened, right? Like a drug was prescribed, the diagnosis was recorded. We don't know what's behind it. And the idea of all this standardization, all this work is to make sense of it so we can actually provide evidence that's complementary to the patient journey. That can be a question as simple as that: what happened to the patients? Who are these patients? A characterization of the patient population. Here, like, who are the patients with MS who have, for example, relapse or unfavorable outcomes? A population level effect estimation: what is causing the specific outcome? Can we actually look into that, like causal effect estimation? And patient level prediction at for each patient, for my patient, what will happen to my patient. So sort of like coming to an inference for an individual patient. So I'm going to hand it over to James to talk a little about the rest of it.
So very quickly, even though I'm a urologist, we all have an interest in other diseases, like I'm a long-term hypertensive. And so the LEGEND study is an interesting one we should all be interested in, right? Because it shows the potential additionality of real-world data in terms of head-to-head comparisons. It's not usually in the interest of pharma to have a head-to-head comparison with another competitor, but I think we should care. And I think LEGEND should be something that you should all pay attention to. This was looking at 5 classes of hypertensive drugs, and they looked at 4.9 million patients. The detail is not that important, except that the guidelines just said you could use any one of them, right? But actually, when they compared them head-to-head within the real-world data arena, they found that thiazides, perhaps the cheapest we have, was more effective and safer than ACE inhibitors, right? But then if you look at, just focus on the 2 top forest plots, you can see that thiazides clearly are better, and it looks like they're safer. If the 2.4 million people that were on ACE inhibitors had chosen thiazides, it is estimated that 3,100 major CV events could potentially have been avoided, right? My wife's a GP. I asked her, have you heard of the LEGEND study? She's never heard of it. Never heard of it, right? So the EAU Guidelines Office realized that we cannot wait for RCTs, right? We want them, but we can't wait. And we led a consortium to secure 12 million to look at prostate cancer outcomes in the real-world data arena to try and help us predict how to separate non-lethal from lethal prostate cancer and to be able to predict outcomes for particular treatments. And we had representatives from the big academic centers, patient organizations, all the big players in industry, SMEs, real-world data analytic experts on a neutral platform. We prioritize the open research questions using 2 prioritization exercises, one for physicians, including industry physicians, and also separate one for patients. And the top 10 in each of the prioritization, 5 of the questions were the same, which shows that when you present evidence to patients, they are quite good at understanding what is important to them. And we did that across 5 countries, taking patients from across 5 countries across Europe. And we've managed to also do something we thought was not possible, encourage people to share data centrally. We're always talking about federated because we believe people will not share data, but actually our experience so far is that 40% of big centers are willing to share data centrally, provided you explain to them what the win-wins are to them. We now have a lot of data now mapped to OMOP. I won't bore you again with the details of this in the interest of time, but some really big centers have shared data, including pharma. We've got data not enough on PROMs, but coming in on omics, imaging data sets. And we've run a study-a-thon because at the end of the day, we want to be able to answer clinically important questions. And this is where I hand over now to Dr. Golozar to finish off this presentation.
So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our study-a-thon. So the first study-a-thon experience that we had together as a 5-day event, a collaboration between PIONEER, OHDSI, and also EDEN, which is an EU initiative for health data, sort of like helping to OMAP or standardize the health data within Europe. The 5-day event was focused on very, very specific objectives to identify patients, prostate cancer patients who are undergoing watchful waiting, to describe the natural history of these patients, and be able to come up with validated risk score to identify those who are benefiting from watchful waiting, and finally using this to inform decision makers for prostate cancer, whether it be physicians, clinicians, that they can use it at the clinic, or to inform guideline groups. So I'll tell you a little bit, apologies to James, I have simplified the prostate cancer management just for the sake of this. After a patient is diagnosed with prostate cancer, 2 things can happen. The patient can be put on a treatment. They're called immediate treatment right after diagnosis. A series of patients or a group of patients are offered delayed treatment or what we're calling conservative management. There are two subgroups of patients, a group of individuals who are young, healthy, fit, and their likelihood of disease progression is several years. So why bother putting them into like intense prostate cancer treatment? And let's instead actually like survey them intensely up until the point that we see there is a progression of the disease. At that point, we cure. The other subgroup of patients are those who are frail. They have other comorbidities, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. These patients are very likely to die from other causes than prostate cancer. Before the prostate cancer is actually like killing them. So then again, why should we bother these folks to go into treatment? Let's not make them suffer more, and we only give them palliative treatment when we are seeing progression of the disease, so to symptomatically manage them, right? We wanted to know more about this specific subgroup. It's called watchful waiting. There's a lot that's been done, mostly coming from randomized clinical trials. We don't have enough information about these specific patient groups in real world, how they're being treated. The idea is not new, but the data is not, there hasn't been any studies at large scale. I'll tell you why. We wanted to do that, and we got together probably 6 months before the study-a-thon happened, and it's quite an important question, but first of all, we had to distinguish between active treatment and conservative management. I can see active treatment in a database because a patient is given a treatment. When I don't see anything, there is no way to infer whether like a treatment is given or not. In places like United States, when their data, the health data is not centralized, a patient can go from a urology clinic to an oncology clinic. They can move from New York to Florida. The health record doesn't move with them. There is no way that I can infer anything based on lack of an observation. Think about that patient care journey that I showed you. Let's assume that we came up with a way to identify the two. Then we have to identify watchful waiting from active surveillance. One was for curative intent in young, healthy individuals, and the other one was for palliative symptoms, just management of symptoms in older individuals. I don't know what's happening in a patient's brain because that's not recorded. It happens during the conversation, and there's no way that we can capture that. So we did a lot of back and forth, and we came up with a definition that you can see on the screen. We were able to identify and recruit 18 different databases from around the world, as you can see, Europe, US, industry partners, and academic partners. We had over 1.5 million newly diagnosed prostate cancer. That's the largest number that has been reported, with over 500,000 that were under conservative management by the definition that we used. We did in-depth characterization of these patients, any type of comorbidities that these patients have recorded in their history. That's what you see in the Manhattans on the right, in the middle, just like a simple characterization of the comorbidities. Who is more likely? So like we see, like, for example, hypertension as the most common condition among these individuals. And we looked at also several outcomes, including survival, emergency department visit, treatment initiation, so on and so forth. Everything that we did is open source. It's publicly available for other folks who wants to explore, come up with hypotheses, and move further. So there's a publication that's almost ready for submission, but more importantly, that was just the start. A lot of questions that happened. We learned a lot of what to do and what not. And this is just a simple and like maybe a little bit outdated list of all the research that came out of it, coming with different risk prediction models, coming with different ways to actually identify and characterize the disease. And even more importantly, getting to know the data better and the dialect between clinicians and data scientists. And that all ended up to the second study-a-thon that just happened 2 weeks ago in Leiden, where we came together 52 people from around the world, online and in person, to look at metastatic hormone-sensitive prostate cancer patients who are benefiting from the approved treatment. Again, identifying a risk prediction model that we can use in practice to pick them up, and also characterizing them. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.